Hello there. This'll have the anti-Brexit Rejoiner Remoaner types weeping in their EU alcohol-free wine, won't it? After all the rhetoric from the anti-Brexit brigade that leaving the EU would be a total trade disaster, we now get the truth of it. Because the Institute for Economic Affairs, the IEA, has produced a report that says the UK's trade patterns with the EU failed to show a Brexit effect either since the referendum or the end of the transition period. Cue much Remoaner wailing. This will set their Brexit reversal plans into, well, reversal. So that's right, no Brexit effect. Brexit effect always being viewed in the negative, of course. And according to the IEA, trade continued to grow between 2016 and the conclusion of the Brexit transition period, showing that the so-called Brexit uncertainty did not reduce UK-EU exchange, with UK goods exports to the EU rising 13.5% between 2019 and 2022, and by 14.3% to the rest of the world. And our services exports went up by 14.8% to the EU and rose 22.1% to the rest of the world. Further, the IEA also says that UK trade patterns compared to other G7 countries have not changed since Brexit. In its press release, the IEA said, "The Office for Budget Responsibility asserted that Brexit barriers would result in a 15% drop in trade volumes, contributing to a 4% lower GDP in the long run. This was based on modelling before Britain left the bloc. But now, according to the IEA report, real-world trade data is painting an entirely different picture." Those pesky real-world numbers getting in the way of those carefully crafted post-Brexit Armageddon forecasts. What will the anti-Brexiteers do now that their magic 4% drop in GDP figure has evaporated into thin air? Well, the obvious answer is they'll now go around claiming that our GDP would be 4% higher than it is now if we'd stayed in the EU. Completely unprovable, of course. The UK Trade Secretary Kemi Badenoch said at the launch of the International Trade Week, "As today's excellent IEA paper written by the economist Catherine McBride shows, contrary to some media reports and many pre-Brexit establishment voices, the data says Brexit has not had a major impact on UK-EU trade. UK trade with EU countries has broadly moved in line with UK trade with non-EU countries." And she also said that the UK should talk itself up and not talk itself down. Report author and trade economist Catherine McBride said, "While the data is still emerging and longer-term effects are as yet unknowable, in general, there has been no real disparity between UK trade with the EU and non-EU countries. Nor has there been a sharp fall in UK-EU trade either at the aggregate or sector level, despite it now being 7 years since the vote to leave the EU and 3 years since the UK actually left." In fact, she said that things like the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, and now rules of origin have changed trading patterns. But there is no evidence of overall adverse effects attributable to Brexit. And she goes on to say that the impact of Brexit on our trade will be down to how the UK uses its newfound Brexit freedoms. But our government has thus far shown it is neither willing nor is it up to the task of using those Brexit freedoms. And something is telling me that Keir Starmer's Labour Party will be just as lacklustre. I bet Nigel Farage is having a good giggle over this one too. especially as a Conservative home poll says that over 2/3 of the Tory party members, 72.27%, almost 3/4 in fact, say they'd accept Nigel Farage back into the party should he want to become a member. And in reply, Nigel Farage said, "After years of being abused by the party, it makes for a welcome change." I wonder. Anyway, I remember all those jibes from the pro-Remain lobby before and after the Brexit vote, with predictions of huge job losses, slumping house prices, no trade deals, etc., while the rest of the world sailed on, leaving us in its wake. Well, it hasn't quite turned out that way, has it? And then there's all those FPBE types on Twitter saying it's time to rejoin, pointing at polls saying huge amounts of people are desperate to get back into the EU. Except when out and about talking to ordinary folk, no one's actually talking about Brexit at all, let alone reversing it and rejoining the EU. Well, firstly, you cannot actually rejoin. There is no route to rejoin. You can only become a new member under their new rules with all that now entails. Joining the Euro and the Schengen area for starters. Then there's the new rules being written up to force all EU member states to take a certain number of asylum seekers or pay massive amounts of levies to Brussels to not take them. And the EU armed forces are beginning to take shape, while EU member states will start losing more of their vetoes over foreign affairs as well as treasury matters. The EU has moved on and is set to become more centralised than the setup we voted to leave. And if our trade patterns haven't been interrupted by leaving, apart from Northern Ireland, which is another matter, then why the need to go through all that divisiveness again just so that certain ego-dented Remoaners can have a second bite of the cherry? However, rumours are swirling that the Lib Dems have hinted that should there be a hung parliament and they are asked by Labour to help them form a government, the price will be another EU referendum. So right now the country is in the mire due to the fallout from the pandemic and the Ukraine war, as well as now the Israeli-Hamas situation, and the Remoaners would drop all that to concentrate on joining the Eurozone. And they'd need to do it quickly, by the way, because the further we get from the day we legally left the EU, the further towards centralisation into a single state the EU gets. That means it's further away from what we left. And the Lib Dems think they'd win the referendum on that basis? Jog on! As the referendum campaign progressed over, say, 18 months to 2 years, the more people would find out about what the EU is becoming and what we would have to give up to join it. To the point I think it would be an emphatic no from the electorate. But as I said, during a time when we need to come together as a country, a referendum of this sort would be ultra divisive. And the Rejoiner Brigade would also be relying on the EU being a beacon of success as compared to the UK. And right now that is not the case. Germany is in recession, the French economy is stalling, and according to a new poll, 23% of Spaniards have experienced anxiety or depression due to the cost of living crisis, and nearly 60% said they felt discouraged or pessimistic due to inflation. While one economist and senior fellow at the Bruegel think tank, Professor Maria de Mertzis, told The Guardian that the EU had to all intents and purposes stopped growing. Does this sound like some good selling points for the Europhiles to tell us to chivvy the people into voting to join the EU?